Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited for this presentation, which is going to be a conversation featuring Sally Korkin, who was involved with Cedar Village from its opening for many years. So welcome, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
What's your background, and obviously how does that dovetail with the Cedar Village?
Okay, so I did not work at either Glen Manor or the Orthodox home. I was hired to work at Cedar Village. I didn't have any kind of a healthcare background at all, but at the time I was working at Drake Center, and Len Sternberg, who was the CEO from Glen Manor or from Cedar Village before they had even opened, I was talking to him one day and he said, "Tell me what you do there. Do you think you'd ever want to work at Cedar Village?" I said, "Well, yeah, maybe." I really hadn't thought about it. And it was about a year before they opened. So he said, "Well, I'll keep you in mind, but we really don't have anything yet." So I would get sort of frustrated with what I would do, and I would call him periodically and say, "What's going on?" And he'd say nothing. But I wasn't proactive to look for anything else at all. And
What were you doing at Drake Center?
At Drake, I was doing public relations and marketing.
Okay.
At Drake, and I was there for almost 5 years. And so Cedar Village was going to open in March of 97. In September of 96, he belonged to Rockdale at the time, and I was coming out of High Holiday Services, and he was coming out of Holiday Services, and he yelled across the parking lot, "Are you still interested?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, call me after the holidays and we'll talk." So that was how I started working at Cedar Village. My first job was marketing and admissions. I didn't have a clinical background, but he said to me, "You can schmooze with the families, you'll be fine. And anything clinical you want to know, you can ask a nurse or ask a social worker." So I started there in October of 96, about 5 months before Cedar Village opened. I knew Glen Manor because my grandmother had lived at Glen Manor for 6 years. I did not know the Orthodox home at all. While we were getting ready to open, we did tour there, etc.
Let me just pause. I think people who are really familiar with the history of Cedar Village and Cincinnati already know this, but some maybe less so, which is that Cedar Village is the result of the merger of the two pre-existing Jewish senior living facilities in Cincinnati. One is the Orthodox home, the other is Glen Manor, which was not Orthodox.
Right.
So I just wanted to clarify for those out there.
Right. So Glen Manor was founded in 1883. The Orthodox Jewish home was founded in 1906. They served different communities. They were located in different places, but the last places they were in Bond Hill, about a mile apart. Glen Manor was on Glen Meadow Lane off of Seymour Avenue, and the Orthodox Jewish home was on Town Street, where one of the exits of I-75 is. However, in the early 60s, there was a group of people who wanted to get the two facilities together because they both needed to build a new place. And that generation couldn't get it to work. That generation couldn't bring it together. And the big sticking point was probably the kosher food. The board of Glen Manor at the time didn't want their residents to have to eat kosher food. And that was the mindset at that time. And Orthodox home had to have kosher food. So they built two new facilities.
So recently I spoke with Rabbi Samantha Shapira. So there were apparently two major issues, of which kosher food was a significant piece of it. The other was that the Orthodox did not want reform services to take place in the building. So they each had their sticking points of the kosher food and the reform services.
Right. Okay.
Do you know if there had been continued conversation throughout the 70s and 80s about the?
No, I think that, once they built these facilities, the facilities were built, and about 25 years later, when they both buildings were 25 years old and both needed repairs and needed major work done, that's when the two organizations got together. So it was sort of starting in the mid 80s. Fortuitously, for some reason, the Orthodox home had bought the property out in Mason. They had bought 80 acres of land on Mason Montgomery Road, which was all farmland, because they thought at some point in time they would maybe build someplace out there. So they came to the match with the land. And there was a group of people from both organizations who got the two together. One of the people was Dave Jacobson, who was a past president of the Orthodox Jewish Home. And I had interviewed him for our 10th anniversary, which was in 2007. And I'm going to read a little bit of what he had said in the history.
That'd be fantastic. Mm-hmm.
Dave Jacobson had been one of the presidents. Dave's father, Jake Jacobson, was president of the Orthodox Jewish Home beginning in 1958. He tried to get Glen Manor and the Orthodox Jewish Home together. The Orthodox Jewish Home was located on Maple Avenue at the time in a large mansion. Jake had been on the board since 1952. Ben Ritter, Eddie Jacobs, and he were the big three, according to Dave. There was a tremendous need to build a new home, and the Orthodox Jewish Home was built on Town Avenue in 1961. Sidney Brandt had donated the land. Dave went to work for his father in 1949, and their company donated the HVAC system to the Orthodox Jewish Home. It was Jake's dream back then to merge the two homes. After Jake passed away in 1965, Dave's dream was to continue the process. He began serving on the Orthodox Jewish Home Board in the early 60s and became president in 1988. In the mid-1980s, Dave spoke to Joel Moskowitz, president from 1985 to 1988, and said, "We should think strongly about how we can get together with Glen Manor. It doesn't make sense to have two homes." In 1987, Dave was at a board meeting and the board wanted him to become the next president. And he stated, "The only way I would think about being president is to make every effort to merge the two homes." Board members thought it was impossible, but gave him the opportunity to try. In 1987, the Orthodox Jewish Home purchased 80 acres in Mason for approximately $900,000. So today the Mason property, the land value is much higher than that. So I guess that was a steal back then, in order to build a new Orthodox Jewish home, and had plans drawn up. When Dave became president, his goal was to make every effort to merge the two homes. That was the theme of his acceptance speech. Dave asked with whom he should meet. He was friendly with a lot of Glen Manor board members, including Frank Harkavy and Larry Shapiro. Ted Schwartz, past president of Glen Manor at 5th and Vine Street, Cincinnati, and Ted is actually the father of Steve Schwartz, who's the current chair of the Cedar Village Foundation Board. Dave asked him if he could get the Glen Manor board to attend a special meeting. He called Dave to get the board to get Dr. Sidney Peerless, whose help Dave had solicited, were the only two in attendance from the Orthodox Jewish Home at the meeting, with 22 in attendance from Glen Manor. No one else from the Orthodox Jewish Home Board attended. Sidney Peerless, who was a prominent doctor in Cincinnati, explained to Orthodox if there were a medical problem on Saturday, it was Dia. At that time, Glen Manor was doing better financially because they had opened admissions to the non-Jewish residents. The Orthodox Jewish Home was running a deficit. Dave was kept informed by Frank Harkavy and Larry Shapiro. And they told Dave, the board needs to start listening, and they will start to listen and be in favor of the merger. The one thing that needed to be agreed upon was kosher food, and the Glen Manor board agreed to that. Dave attributed the success of the merger to Frank Harkavy. He and Dave grew up together. He said, "I don't know where I would be without Frank's support. He kept encouraging me." Frank was selected to be the facilitator of the board and agreed to take on the responsibility in 1992. Someone was needed to head the fundraising, and Frank solicited Paul Heim to chair the capital campaign. It took a lot of work and a lot of people and friends to make the merger happen, raise the money, and build Cedar Village.
Great.
So that was Dave Jacobson's take on the merger. So Cedar Village was the result of the merger of the two Jewish facilities in Cincinnati. During the 5 months before Cedar Village opened, we all worked at an office that was in Sharonville on Executive Park Drive. And there were like maybe or 6 people that worked in that office because they were still running the 2 homes. They were still running Glen Manor. They were still running the Orthodox home.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who were working in the office, in the Cedar Village office, were people who were specifically hired to get Cedar Village off the ground. I remember that, the CFO was there, and there was somebody who was doing operations was there, and I was there, and there was an executive assistant, and Len Sternberg's office was there because by then they had appointed somebody else to run the Orthodox Jewish home. So they were running the 2 homes, and we were planning for the move. And we couldn't get into the building. I remember, I guess, in November, they had sort of a special dedication for the major donors. And it was a freezing cold day. I'm just thinking about this now. And they put a tent up in the parking lot because nobody, they couldn't take people into the building for tours, but they could have pictures up and, and show what was going on. And it had snowed. And so it was cold. They were, the snow was dripping down the sides of the tent, and it was, unseasonable for November. But that was sort of how they were thanking the donors out in the tent. Conversely, when they had an event after Cedar Village opened, and again, they had a tent out in the parking lot because it was, they couldn't get that many people in the building. It was a very, very hot day out in the tent in the summertime. So you can't count on Cincinnati weather. So they, the move plan was, made. Everything was planned and plotted out, but they couldn't open until they were approved by the state of Ohio. Way that now the state comes in once a year for their annual inspection and for the annual survey, unannounced. We were going to have a survey unannounced so that the state of Ohio could deem that Cedar Village could open. What they did was they picked 2 women who lived at Glen Manor who were pretty high functioning, and they moved them in on the Azalea wing all by themselves with all the staff. So they were treated like royalty. And they were there probably for a couple of days, and the state still didn't come. So, finally, somebody called and they said, we really need to get this open because one of the things I was doing was I was working on admissions and I was fielding calls, and family members would call me and they'd say, I want to come out. I live in Nebraska. I live in California. When should I make my plane reservations to come? And the answer would be, we don't know when we can tell you to come because we don't know when we're opening.
Yeah.
So they finally determined, after the 2 ladies lived there and they had, white glove service, and they brought the meals and they took the lids off the meals, and it was very lovely and elegant, probably never to happen again. But they had to watch the nurses do the charting, and they had to do all the safety inspections. So on March 16th, 1997, Cedar Village opened. And those ladies just stayed through. They didn't have to go back to Glen Manor. They could just stay through when Cedar Village opened. So, but there was a lot of red tape and a lot of things that had to happen before everybody could move there. One of the things that they didn't want people bringing their suitcases and all their stuff with them and all their belongings. They moved those in ahead. They moved those in. They could, I guess they moved it in ahead. So when everybody got there, their rooms were set up. So everybody could, we had big plastic shopping bags made with the Cedar Village logo on them. And every resident could bring their personal items in like 2 or 3 shopping bags because we had vans and buses to deliver, to transport everybody. And so everybody was picked up on that Sunday morning at either Glen Manor or the Orthodox home. The families could not help their loved ones moved. Everybody had to come officially on the bus, on the van. The family members couldn't wait at the door. All of the family members waited in the CRCC, and there was music and there were bagels and, all kinds of balloons and all kinds of fun things. And when the buses pulled up, the people standing at the door were the board members, and the board members were greeting them as they got off the bus. Everybody got a flower. And then they went into the CRCC and could greet their family members, and then the family members could take them up to their rooms. But it was all very regimented, and it had to be that way because otherwise it would have been a mob scene if 185 sets of family members were standing in the parking lot waiting for the buses to pull up.
Absolutely. So it sounds like an incredible amount of coordination and planning.
It was an extremely amazing amount of coordination. And other than, I think, maybe 5 or 6 or 8 people had to come by ambulance because they couldn't walk onto a van or a bus, everybody came within the first 4 hours. So, starting out at 8 in the morning, and by 12, everybody was moved in and everybody had lunch.
Oh, wonderful.
So it was really an amazing, emotional day. I remember I don't know why we did this, but it was a cruise theme. So everybody wore little white sailor hats and there was like all kinds of, things. The cruise is beginning, and welcome on the cruise. So
yeah,
it was a really emotional day, and everything worked like clockwork. Now, as the day wore on, we had staff from Glen Manor, we had staff from the Orthodox home, we had new staff because they weren't really sure how many people would come out to Mason from the inner city and from Bond Hill, and some of them lived downtown. So there was a lot of staff, and I remember the nurses talking about at 11 o'clock that night, they were all exhausted, sitting on the floor hoping that the next round of nurses would come to relieve them, because nobody had ever worked in the building before. They couldn't really come and be trained in the building because the building wasn't open. Oh, wow. So it was very difficult because they couldn't go through anything until they actually got there to work.
Well, ultimately, the nurses were relieved, but how did that ended up getting worked out?
Yeah. The new nurses came, everything was fine, but they didn't know if anybody was going to drive out to Mason at 11 o'clock at night for the second shift. Because at that time, we didn't have 12-hour shifts. Everything was 8-hour shifts. So it was 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7. Mm-hmm. So everything opened up, and it was great. Everything was great. And it just was a very amazing day. When Cedar Village opened, it was the kosher food, but in your own room, in your own apartment, you could eat what you want. Mm-hmm. Family members could come in and bring anything into the building as long as their loved ones ate it in their rooms and their apartments. We were the only facility in the whole country with 2 places of worship under one roof. Really? That was part of the merger agreement. And at the time, Glen Manor had rabbinic interns from HUC, who were the initial Reform rabbis, and then we had hired an Orthodox rabbi from the community to be the initial Orthodox rabbi. And religiously, it all worked out well, and everybody worked side by side, and and prayed side by side, and it was amazing. It was really wonderful. And one of the things I remember when I was doing admissions, and I would get all kinds of calls, like the calls, when should I come to move my mother in? But I got a call from somebody, and the question was, will everybody from Glen Manor live on one floor, and will everybody from the Orthodox home live on another floor? Because that was the stereotype in the minds of Cincinnati's Jewish community at that time. And I had to think pretty quickly on my feet. And so I said, no, the residents will be placed by medical diagnosis, not by branch of Judaism. But that's pretty religiously,
I think it's pretty shocking for me to hear that it would even be on people's minds to segregate according to religious practice in Cedar Village.
Right. But that's why Cincinnati had 2 Jewish homes for so many years. There's other cities that happened as well. But those were the mindsets of the Reform community and the Orthodox community, unfortunately.
Wow, even as late as 1997.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Less than a quarter century ago. Yeah. Wow. And so, One thing I remember from we previously chatted several months ago. One thing that was fascinating to me was hearing Fountain View had initially been one of the the healthcare areas, right? It wasn't
Right, right,
initially
right.
intended to be assisted living. What was it initially?
So when they built Cedar Village, they kind of guesstimated how many beds there should be based on what they had at Glen Manor and what they had at the Orthodox home.
Hmm.
And so Cedar Village was originally built with 200 healthcare rooms, and they decided, okay, we're going to build a new facility. They added Oakview, so it was 50, 51, I think 51 independent assisted living apartments, because they were all certified as assisted living, but in the beginning was primarily independent. And where Fountain View is now, that was the original Alzheimer's unit. And
Wow.
The area now where the rehab gym is, that was an area where residents could wander into from the Alzheimer's unit.
Mm.
And it had a dining room table, and it had, a living room, and people could come in there and they could, fold laundry, and they could do puzzles. And it was sort of like an extension of their home. So they felt like they were in their home.
So that's why
And
that's why by the Fountain View nurses station there's that door that enters into the therapy area, because it was initially connected to all that, you're saying.
right, right,
Oh wow.
right, right. So it was all connected.
Mhm.
And at some point in time, I think we kept the census pretty high, but the 200 beds was, it was pretty easy to keep it up in the beginning. And in the beginning, we didn't even admit anybody until, we made sure that everything was under control. So at one point in time, the census was slipping a little bit. I wasn't doing the admissions anymore. And they started looking at the building and thinking, what else could they do, and what else would be necessary for the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, there were people who wanted to live in assisted living, but they couldn't afford to live in a few apartments, nor did they need such a big apartment.
Mm.
And so they met with the architects and the builders, and they converted the whole first floor area, which used to be the Alzheimer's unit, into the assisted living studio apartments, and moved the Alzheimer's unit up to the third floor.
Wow. What so you said you transitioned to a different role. So you're no
Right.
longer at admissions. What had you
Right.
transitioned?
I did that for a couple of years. Then I did development, because at the time there had been a contract, was hired contract to raise the money to be the fundraiser when Cedar Village opened.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started working there, I picked up a lot of those pieces along the way, but we really didn't have anybody doing development. But I worked on the whole plaque project, where we had to plaque the entire building with all the plaques.
You had to?
That was one of my roles, was like working with the sign company. That was just like one of these other duties as a sign. And so I was in charge of all of the plaques, and making sure that the plaques were right, and making sure that the names were spelled right. And
Oh wow. Wow, a lot of plaquing.
Put up, I think that was what we had been in the summer. So I was doing some fundraising, doing the plaques outside the rooms, and everything had to match. And yes.
Wow, a lot of plaquing. Plaques. One thing I recall from our previous conversation from the fall was that some of the rooms had been converted, that they had been galleys or kitchens, and then in Fountain View had been then converted into rooms.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because when Cedar Village opened, the premise was that everybody would eat where he or she lived. So that's why each of the units upstairs has its own dining room, and the Alzheimer's unit on the first floor, there was a dining room on each side, parallel to what's upstairs. So there were two pretty large dining rooms in that unit. And when they moved the unit upstairs, and they built the new dining room for the Oakview and Fountain View dining room, the garden dining room. Then they converted those into new apartments, into a little bit larger apartments.
When was the garden dining room created?
The garden dining room opened in 2004.
Oh, wow. So it really wasn't from the outset.
No, from the outset. So Oakview had a dining room that was up on its third floor.
Really?
Which was then also converted into 2 apartments. So I don't know if you've wandered around, but do you know where the beauty shop is on the 3rd floor of Oakview?
I do. Yes.
Okay. It was right across from there.
Oh, wow.
It was like big space right across from there. And sort of one of the problems was that the kitchen was far from there. Because in order to bring the food up, they had to go down 3 flights of stairs and over across the building into the kitchen. So there were some dining issues, we'll just say that. And so they thought, how can they rectify that? And building the garden dining room was the way to go. So there was a lot of land there. There was 80 acres. And so they could push back and build the garden dining room and space off of the hallway going down to the Oakview apartment.
Oh, that's great. That's great. What had the therapy area been before? I'm sorry, when did it switch over to become therapy?
So therapy had been up on the 2nd floor, which I think then was converted to like some activity area. In 2013, 14, we did a big rehab campaign, and that's when they converted that area over to be the therapy gym.
Oh, very neat.
Was at that point in time, because again, the space that was upstairs was getting way too small. It was, and then we converted the azalea and the apple wings into rehab floors, because before that it was just all the long-term care floors were up there.
There hadn't been any rehab areas?
No, people who came in for rehab just were placed in whatever room.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So that's more recent, the creation of rehab.
So the rehab floors, when we did the whole big project, I guess 2012, 13, 14, something like that, that's when they decided to take those 2 wings and make them into the rehab rooms, because those rooms were all built with showers. Because when Cedar Village, I'm just remembering this now, when Cedar Village was first opened, there were 2 units that did have showers already, apple and azalea, because they wanted those to be for people who were needed nursing care, but who were more independent. So as you can imagine, everybody wanted their mother to be in one of those rooms, because those rooms all had showers.
Of course.
So that was, of course. So that was a little bit tricky.
Yeah. Wow.
But that's why they picked those for the rehab rooms, and they redid them and put in new floorings and put in amenities. And at the same time was when they built the rehab gym.
Oh, that's very neat.
And then the pool was added. The pool was added in 2014 as part of that whole rehab, the whole rehab project.
It was funded by the foundation, right? The Cincinnati Jewish Foundation.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Yep. One thing I was really interested and intrigued by our conversation back in the fall was the Israel trips. That there wasn't just 1 or even 2, but 3 trips that Cedar Village took, including staff, to Israel. So when was the first trip, and how did that come about?
So our first Israel trip was in 2007, and it was in conjunction with our 10th anniversary, because we tried to do things sort of rolled around special dates. And because we were a new facility, it couldn't be like for our 50th or 100th, it had to be for the 10th. And there was a nursing home in Cleveland, Menorah Park, which is one of the big nursing homes in Cleveland, had done a mission to Israel, and we worked with their staff and sort of used their pattern and all their materials, and we got the same guide and raised money for people to go to Israel. So that was the first one, and in 2007 for the 10th anniversary. And the staff was fully funded. The residents, if they could afford to pay for themselves, they paid, but if they couldn't afford to pay for themselves, everybody could go. And everybody had a buddy. And it was a 10-day trip to Israel. So that was our first trip. The second one, we thought we had to have a different spin on each trip. Okay. So the second one was in 2009, and it was as we were about to start our 13th year, and it was our B'nai Mitzvah trip in honor of Cedar Village's 13th anniversary. Because again, we did a lot of celebration around our 13th anniversary. Oh, really? And even had a candle lighting ceremony like at a bar bat mitzvah where where we had the poem, and which I wrote the poem because I like to write things, but I wrote the poem, and then Mrs. Schwartz come up and write candle number 1, and we had 13 people who came up and lit the candles for our 13th anniversary. So the second mission was our B'nai Mitzvah mission, and it was for the residents to be able to celebrate their bar and bat mitzvah in Israel. Obviously, the women had never had a bat mitzvah. Some of the men had, some of the men hadn't. Yeah. And again, the staff was there with them, and that was a very emotional thing. There were, I think, 4 of us who were Jewish in the staff, and we all had, we all partook in the ceremony as well. That's really neat. So that was like a very emotional, wonderful trip. And somehow we were able to broadcast it back so that the families could watch it.
Oh, wow. That sounds really nice. That must have been quite the treat.
So that was the second one. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, again, we needed a hook. And it was in 2012, and it was an interfaith mission. And it was with Otterbein. It was with Otterbein, and our rabbi at the time was Rabbi Gary Walder, and he worked with their pastor there, and we had study sessions together, and they came, the weekend before we left, they came to Cedar Village for a service on the Saturday morning, and we went there on Sunday morning for their church service, just so that we could learn about their religion. Yeah. And then our sessions there, we did things both in the Jewish arena in Israel and in the non-Jewish arena in Israel.
Yeah, very neat. So, and also significantly related to those trips, artwork was brought back to the building. And I remember the second trip, there was a couple of paintings actually kind of near the bathroom, near where the bird cage is. But more significantly, and certainly more noticeable, is an entire series of holiday artwork that is near the CRCC in that hallway.
Right.
So what's the story behind the artwork coming to Cedar Village?
So the artwork coming to Cedar Village, we had, obviously, as you can expect, we had some very generous board members, very generous members of our community who helped us go on that mission. And we were in the 2007, our first mission, we were leaving on Monday. And Friday, one of our very generous board members called me, and he said, I want you to buy some art for Cedar Village while you're in Israel. I said, okay, that's great. Yeah. And, and he kind of gave me a range. I said, oh, that's great. And I went, tearing down to the finance office and saying, how can we do this? Credit cards, what are we going to do? So I think we actually got some blank checks that Carol Silver Elliott, who was the CEO at the time, was able to bring with her. And we said to our tour guide, we need to buy some art. And we were in Spot, and he took us to the Kedi Kamu Gallery, and we walked in there just to see what was there. And we looked around, and we started, sort of doing the math in our head, because the idea was we were there during Sukkot and Simchat Torah, and that we would buy some of the art from Sukkot and Simchat Torah. And the staff that came in there at the time, we could buy the whole series. And so we were able to buy the whole series. They were framed beautifully, as you know. Yeah. And we were able to buy prints for everybody who was on the trip, staff and residents, of the two holidays of Sukkot and Simchat Torah, which I have hanging in my dining room.
Wonderful.
So that was, that was really an amazing bonus of the trip, was to be able to bring back art to signify that experience in Spot.
That's really wonderful.
I want to talk about the perception of how far away from the Jewish community Cedar Village was at the time.
Sure.
And what a schlep it was to get to Mason, and the traffic, and when we could do admissions, one of the first admissions I did, there was a daughter and said, I can only come in on a Sunday. I said, okay. So I went out to Mason, and, on a Sunday, there's no traffic going to Mason. So that's a plus side. Yeah. And in 1997 now, it's only gotten worse. And I stood in the lobby waiting for her, and she came in the front door and she screamed at me, who told them to put this in Mason? They didn't listen to the little people. We wanted it to be in Amberley, but oh no, they had to put it in Mason, and it's so far away. So I looked at her and I said, well, that's fine, but if you want your mother to come to Cedar Village, we can't pick up the building and move it back to Amberley, because there is no space in Amberley to begin with. And so this is where Cedar Village is located. So that was, that was sort of my first inkling that distance was a problem. Now, at the time, and, certainly now, not everybody who's Jewish comes to Cedar Village and came to Cedar Village, because if you want to be able to visit your loved one every day, if you live in Kenwood, well, now the Kenwood wasn't open when we were there, but there's Williamsburg, which is near Wyoming, and there's the Seasons, which is near Kenwood, and there were some in Amberley as well. But we were located where we were located, and yes, the traffic was terrible, and there was really nothing that could be done about it. And people learned to do the back ways and come up the back way and come up 75 and cut across, and they made it work.
That's good.
So at one point, and this was way towards the beginning, it was before they had built Deerfield Town Center, and they were thinking about what they were going to do with that land, and there was like a rumor that Nordstrom's was going to be built in that space. So then we were all saying, well, the people who don't want to come to visit their mother because it's so far will certainly come to Nordstrom's in Mason, because there was no Nordstrom's in Kenwood yet. So that was, but Nordstrom never came. But that was, yes, we're far if you want it to be far, but if you don't want it to be far, it is where it is.
It's funny. I think a lot of places it's not really that far, but for Cincinnati, if it's beyond 15 minutes, it's far.
Right. Oh, definitely. When I first started working there, and when I worked at Drake Center, it was literally 5 minutes from my house. And I talked to somebody that I knew from New York, and she said, how do you like your new job? I said, oh, I love it, but it takes me a half an hour to get there. And she said, don't say it takes a half an hour to get there. In New York, everything takes 2 hours to get there.
Exactly. So, it'd be a short commute relative to that.
Right. But I think, everybody's so spoiled about how easy and how quick it is to get places.
We are spoiled with commute times in Cincinnati.
Yes.
We are.
So, and I think now, and ironically, when I retired in the fall of 2015, and the week after I retired was when they opened up that new I-71 Mason Montgomery Road North Loop, where you could loop around and avoid all of the Fields-Erdel traffic.
So beforehand, it had been kind of a mess to get off of the 71 North?
Yeah, because you got off at Fields-Erdel, and there was only one exit for Fields-Erdel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So see, you didn't know that. Yeah, and that's why it was such a bottleneck out there, because when Cedar Village first opened in 1997, nothing was out there. P&G was there. The Marriott Hotel was there, and we were further out, but everything else was farmland. There was nothing. There was no commercial growth. There was nothing.
Was that nice?
Stores, there were no restaurants, nothing.
Was that nice to see as the years went on for those shops, those stores, the commercial activity to open up?
Oh, I think so, and I think it was good. It was good for the community, and it was good
Hmm.
for, you know, for for the whole Mason area. So, they had the foresight to buy the land out there.
Yeah.
Um, so, here we are going on year 24.
Mhm.
The other thing that happened was, in addition to our 80 acres, and in 2000, we sold the front 35 acres to the Health Alliance at that time, which
Mhm.
Jewish Hospital was a part of, because they
Mhm.
were going to plan to build a Jewish hospital out there that never happened. And then that land eventually reverted back to Jewish Hospital, to the Jewish Foundation. So now that land is back in the Jewish community again.
Mhm.
The Jewish Federation bought another 30 acres adjacent to Cedar Village, going back on Cedar Village Drive, because that's
Hmm.
where they were going to have the JCC.
Oh, really?
That was the original site. It was going to be a campus. The original
Hmm.
name for Cedar Village, besides being Cedar Village, it was called Cedar Village, a Campus for Jewish Life.
Wow. Wow.
And everything was supposed to come out there. The JCC was supposed to come out there, and the schools were supposed to come out there, and the agencies were supposed to come out there, and the only thing that came out there was Cedar Village.
Wow. Speaking of names, do you know what the origin or what's the background behind the name Cedar Village?
I actually happen to know that because my
Yeah. All right. I'm
okay,
excited.
all right. My brother John Fox had done all the initial market research for Cedar Village. It was way, way, way before I even knew that I was going to be working there.
Yeah.
And they had focus groups, and they came up with, they wanted something kind of biblical. And
Hmm.
so the cedar tree was how they came up with the name Cedar Village.
Any particular reason why that specific tree?
I don't know. I just
Okay.
know that, but I mean, I had seen some of his research when I had his files someplace. I don't have them
Mhm.
anymore, but just like a whole list of all different names that people had picked and
Yeah.
suggested, but the name was
Wow.
Cedar Village.
Wow.
But it was called Cedar Village, a Campus for Jewish Life.
Oh, wow. So the cedar to that biblical connection of that style of tree,
The cedar tree,
and
yeah.
then village to, I guess, connote a communal feeling,
Right,
right?
yeah. Probably, although on the property there's the big oak tree,
Mm.
which is why the Oakview Apartments are called Oakview,
Mm-hmm.
because they overlook the oak tree on the property, which when we first were there, it was like 250 years old. So I guess it's going on 300
Wow.
years. And then Fountain View was called Fountain View because it overlooked the fountain.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of objects outside of the building, what's the story behind the huge rock, the huge stone?
The stone was brought to Cincinnati, to Cedar Village, to commemorate Israel's 50th anniversary.
Hmm. So
Um,
that would have been basically a year after opening. So it would have been
right. So
1998.
in 1998, there was a group in the community that wanted to have a permanent monument to the Israeli soldiers, to the fallen Israeli soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And they selected Cedar Village as a site of it because at the time there was no other property in Cincinnati which the Jewish community owned. And where they were going to stay. So the JCC at the time was still on Summit Road, and they didn't want to have it to pick one synagogue over another synagogue. And so Cedar Village was selected as the site of it.
Wow.
And the day that it came, and I remember this, it came on this big trailer, and we had a big ceremony, and the press was there, and everybody was crying, and they hoisted it up, and they had, I don't know, smeared whatever concrete to make it stick onto the big platform, and they lowered it down onto the platform that was there.
Oh, wow.
So that was for the 50th anniversary of Israel, and for many, many years, Cedar Village hosted the Yom HaZikaron ceremony.
Do you know when that stopped? Was that probably when the JCC was created?
I think when the JCC was created, maybe a couple more years we had it, and then they decided to move everything to the JCC.
Uh-huh.
Because the JCC opened in 2008.
Yep. There's like a sundial near there, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
What's the story behind the sundial? I know it has the priestly blessing on it from the Torah. What's the story behind the sundial?
So the Friends of Cedar Village, which, started out as two auxiliaries, one from Glen Manor, one from the Orthodox Jewish Home, and they both merged into the Friends of Cedar Village. And over the years, they did many, many projects for the residents. They still run the gift shop when the gift shop is open. Someday maybe the gift shop will reopen. You haven't been there since the gift shop, right?
It's been closed. I mean, I started during the pandemic, so it's been closed the entire time.
You've never shopped at the gift shop,
right?
You've never had that experience. So they did a lot of things for the residents, and one of the things that they decided to do was to build a sundial. So a few years ago, they had this sundial created, which is out near where the rock is. And that's a project of the Friends of Cedar Village, in addition to the bricks. There are bricks around the sundial, commemorative bricks. There's a whole group of commemorative bricks that are sort of on outside the hallway, down outside where the garden dining room is. So that got filled up, and then they started putting the bricks around the sundial.
Wow, that's very neat. Also, outside of the garden dining room, there's that really neat sculpture. What's the story behind that sculpture?
So that sculpture was commissioned by Wilbur Cohn when his daughter Linda died. Maybe 10, I don't know when it was, maybe 10 years ago. And the significance is there's an L for Linda, and then the circle is the sun, and there was a whole significance for that. And that's like sort of another signature part of the artwork in Cedar Village. Somewhere there's a description of it, but I don't know where it could be.
Yeah. Speaking of the artwork at Cedar Village, something you had shared with me was really intriguing, because in the administrative wing, there's a bunch of art by Mordechai, I think Rosenstein, right? So, but there's a couple of pieces that are duplicates. There's two of certain pieces, and you were telling me that that these pieces were purchased for the two previous homes, and when they merged, they had duplicates of them.
Right. So they hung up a whole set, and then we all could select for our office from the extras. So I don't know if you've got one in your office or not.
I not at the moment. I'm sure I can procure one.
Yeah, right. So, but I remember, I think they laid them all out before they hung them up, and then there were the extras, and so people could put them like up on the units. Some of them are, and some of them are, in people's offices. Yeah.
So the Mordechai Rosenstein art, and he's still alive and kicking.
Right. Because I saw that interview with him, and that was really very interesting. There's a lot of history there, and there's a lot of meaningful art there, and there, the community, I think, can be very proud of what they created there.
Yeah, for sure. Any interesting other stories or things that we might not have expected, or reasons why certain things look the way they are in the building?
I think sort of one of the significant things is that when I would do orientation in the boardroom, and in the boardroom, it really gives a sense of Cedar Village's history, because on one wall are all of the past presidents of Glen Manor. On another wall are all the past presidents of the Orthodox Jewish Home. And then on a third wall are the presidents now they're chairs of Cedar Village. So, when you look at those pictures, the presidents of the Orthodox Home held office for 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, some of them way back when, they had very lengthy
10 years
stays in their offices. Glen Manor was 2 years, 2 years, 2 years. So,
Oh.
that's why there's many more pictures of presidents from Glen Manor than from the Orthodox home. And in the boardroom, we created another plaque for each of them, which had the names of all of the past presidents and the years that they were president. So that if for staff members who are in the boardroom, or if you have any kind of orientation in the boardroom or any meetings, I think that's really what strikes people is the sense of history in that one room.
Mm-hmm. That's really great.
And then just throughout the building, there's pieces of art, and I think the case in the front lobby has a lot of beautiful art, some of which came from the Glen Manor, some of which came from the Orthodox home, some of which was donated over the years to Cedar Village. But that certainly is a part of our history. And our tours, which are usually not out on display, but on opening day they brought the tourists from Glen Manor, they brought the tourists from the Orthodox Jewish home, and that was very significant because that was a part of the history which is now at Cedar Village.
Oh, wonderful.
I know some other history too, but it's not worthy of screen times.
All right. Well, it sounds like there were a lot of good times over the years.
Yes, it was wonderful, and I was very fortunate to be there for 19 years. When I first started there, I didn't know how long I would be there, and I ended up working there for 19 years and retiring from there.
Amazing.
And it was a big part of my life. And we did great things. We did great things for the residents. We did great things for the community. It was really a gathering place for so many people. We had wonderful concerts. We had all kinds of fun things going on all the time because the bottom line is you want the residents to feel like that's their home and to enhance their lives.
Yeah.
So as I grew there kind of, and my role kind of evolved into different things and fundraising and marketing and public relations and whatever, my degree's in elementary education.
Oh,
So
wow.
never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that this is what I would have done with my life. But, you never know. On the job training,
Right.
over the years, it's just, it's on the job and being trained people. And when I started doing admissions, it was true. Anything that I didn't know, any phrase that I didn't know, I could ask a nurse, ask a social worker, and they could tell me. And honestly, I'm Reform. I grew up Reform. I grew up at Rockdale Temple. My learning curve was really larger for Orthodox, the Orthodox community, and the words that I didn't know what they were when I first started working there. Yeah. So my knowledge increased many fold.
Yeah, I'm sure. Wow. It's good. Yeah. It's good learning. All right. Well, cool.
So, and I think that's, it was, and I guess one of the other things is that in the beginning, somebody said to me, well, do you have to be Jewish to work at Cedar Village? And I said, no, you don't have to be Jewish to work at Cedar Village. You had to be, in the very beginning, you had to be Jewish to live at Cedar Village, but not to work at Cedar Village.
When did they change that?
Well, in the very beginning, the admission policy was Jewish only, or a Jewish spouse.
Really?
But in that generation, there really weren't many with a Jewish spouse. However, Glen Manor opened their non-Jewish community for financial reasons. And so when Cedar Village opened, anybody who lived at Glen Manor had the opportunity to move to Cedar Village. And I think at the time, there were maybe 10 or 12 non-Jewish residents who came at the time. And then in maybe 2000, it became evident as the numbers were dropping and the admissions were dropping, that it was necessary to open up to the non-Jewish community.
So really the first few years
because
it was almost entirely Jewish.
Right, except for the few people who had
grandfathered in,
moved there. But right, but at the time when we made that decision to open, and it was a board decision, and it was it was tough, but it was from a business model was the right thing to do. But there were very few Jewish retirement communities that hadn't opened their doors because it was really the necessity of survival. And at the time when we opened up, most of them were in Ohio, so maybe Ohio had different regulations than other states. It was the two in Cleveland, but Cleveland had a huge Jewish population. It was the Dayton one, it was us, and maybe Columbus, but that was it. And we all kind of opened up at the same time. The two in Cleveland, I think, the latest to open up, and they have since merged.
Yep.
The two Cleveland nursing homes that are on the same property.
Yeah, Menorah Park and Montefiore.
Yeah, right. So they have merged as well.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's my story of Cedar Village.
That's great. Well, thank you, Sally. Thank you so much for sharing this history, this knowledge. Thank you.
Okay.
It's really great.
Okay.
All right.
You are welcome, and look forward to seeing it on screen.
Absolutely.